Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight's show is about the word we and what we mean when we use it. Now, in English it seems deceptively simple because we is simply the plural of I. So I refers to the person speaking, or sometimes the writer if it's a written text. And that's the so-called first-person form, I. And we refers to the speaker or writer plus someone else, so it's the plural of I, it's first-person plural. Now, I got interested in we a few years ago when I was investigating first-person pronouns in Comanche. In Comanche, your choice of forms depends on some factors that you don't have to take into account at all if you're just a speaker of English. First of all, where the English speaker simply distinguishes singular I from plural we, the Comanche speaker makes a three-way distinction between singular n, which means I, dual nuk, which means we two, or two of us, and plural nna, which means we in the sense of three or more of us. Let's take a look at the chart here, try to make that a little bit more graphic. The first person singular, the red face shows that we're just talking about this person in red. That would be I, the person speaking. We say I in English, n in Comanche, and we're referring only to the speaker. In the second figure here, the speaker is talking about himself or herself plus one other person. So in English we say we. In Comanche we say nuk, which is the dual form, meaning two people, the speaker and one other. And in the third case, let's say the speaker is talking about himself or herself plus a bunch of other people, so that the total is three or more. In English you still say we, same as before, but in Comanche you use a different form, nna, and this refers to the speaker plus two or more other people. So we have singular, dual, and plural. Now already things are a little bit more interesting because of this extra little glitch in Comanche, or the deficiency in English if you want to look at it that way. It's an extra little fact that English speakers will have to learn in the early stages of studying Comanche if they want to become fluent and to understand properly what's being said. Now, I had learned about dual versus plural categories during my training in linguistics. It's actually quite common in the languages of the world to have this kind of number distinction, three-way rather than two-way. In fact, in Sanskrit, I believe there's a four-way distinction, so that there's a trial form which refers to exactly three of something, and then the plural as such would be four or more. Anyway, I was doing some intensive research on the Comanche language and beginning to teach it, and also trying to gain at least some fluency in speaking and understanding it to make my teaching better and so that I could appreciate it better. So it was really becoming part of my daily life and consciousness. So even though I had studied about these categories in the classroom, now it was really something that I had to kind of incorporate into my own consciousness. I had to sort of look at the world in a singular versus dual versus plural way when I was looking for the word for we, and also in other cases as well. Because this is a distinction that's pretty pervasive in Comanche. It applies not only to pronouns like we, but also to nouns and to some verb forms. I think we have a chart on this as well. So the title here is How Many is Plural. As I just said, you have singular n for I, nuk for we is the dual, and nna for we is the plural. But just say the word for dogs. If someone asks me, I learned pretty soon, like any native Comanche speaker, if someone said, how do you say dogs in Comanche? I'd say, well, that depends. How many are we talking about? If you say just a singular dog, that's sari. If you're talking about two dogs, you say sariwak. And if it's three or more dogs, the plural form, you say sarina. So you have singular, dual, and plural again. And this sometimes also applies to verb forms. Kima means come here, talking to one person. Kimawak means y'all two come here. Kimaka means y'all come, meaning three or more people are being asked to come. So this number distinction is pretty pervasive in Comanche. But there's a second factor altogether, and this is what I really wanted to talk about, to focus on tonight, and that is the concept of person, as in first person, second person, and third person. The concept of person figures into the word we in a very different way in Comanche than it does in English. Let's go to the chart again briefly. For those of you that aren't used to the grammatical terminology, first person means the person who's doing the speaking or the writing, if this is a written language that we're talking about. Second person refers to the person that you're talking to or writing to. And third person refers to all others. So typically, just to use English as a reference, first person is I or we, second person is you, and third person is he, she, or it, or they. That's how person works, just generally. Now, Comanche, the interesting glitch in Comanche that has to do with person is that Comanche distinguishes between what are called inclusive and exclusive forms of we. Inclusive and exclusive first person forms. Inclusive we includes the speaker plus at least one second person element, that is me and you, say, me and you singular, would be inclusive we. The exclusive form of we includes the speaker plus at least one other third person, but it excludes the second person. Let's see if we can make that a little bit clearer with the chart as well. Here. So here we have inclusive, which means basically I plus you. It could be a singular you or a plural you, but I plus you is an inclusive form of we. The exclusive would be I plus someone else, and it does not include you. It excludes you. Now let's look at a Comanche sentence that will illustrate this. Now the question here is who's going? We can say two sentences in Comanche which both mean we're going. But one of them is going to sound more like an invitation, and the other one is going to sound like the hearer, the person listening, is being left out. So here's the speaker with the open mouth. He's got someone else next to him. Here's the speaker and someone next to him. This person over here is the listener. So the speaker in the first case says to the listener, "Mi arue nag." That means we're going. But it means we too and not you are going. Specifically, this is the exclusive form. It excludes the person you're talking to. On the other hand, that in the same kind of situation, the speaker might say, "Mi aroi takwe." And that means essentially you and I are going, because it's a dual form. There's two of us. It includes I plus some second person element. So it means you and I are going. We would translate both of these as we're going in English. You don't know whether it's two people, three, or how many in English. And you don't know whether it includes a person spoken to or not. I don't know about you, but I've been in situations where I misunderstood something as an invitation and it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be an exclusive form of we. We're going, not you. This kind of distinction is also pretty common in languages of the world. Now, as I learned to use this second factor in the choice of Comanche we, I found out that I was really thinking of we quite differently than I was used to from English and from most European languages that I had studied. Now, linguists and philosophers could debate at great length, I guess, about whether native Comanche speakers and native English speakers actually have a different concept of the world, and that they must have a different concept if their language is arranged so differently, and whether they have a different kind of mental organization of persons or of their place in the universe or something like that. Who knows? But this got me looking at the word we in terms of, in English, and really in any language, in terms of the hidden self-concept and sometimes the hidden agendas behind its use, specifically in English, and I'd like to give some examples of that now. Occasionally, as in the case where I thought I was being invited to something and I wasn't because it was exclusively, we can come up with some conversational misunderstandings. Let's look at the chart one more time here. Now this is titled Ambiguous We. Again, that's a bit of a grammatical term. It's a technical term in linguistics. Ambiguity just means a case where something that you say could have more than one meaning. It could be interpreted in more than one way. And as I've just shown, I think we is very ambiguous in English. It could be dual or plural. We don't know how many people we're talking about. It could be inclusive or exclusive. We don't know because our language just doesn't make that distinction. Let's take an example here. To show the ambiguity, we could say this same sentence the same way, and it could be interpreted either as exclusive or inclusive. We need to go now, or we need to go now. If you kind of imagine how this might be continued, you can bring out the difference in English with the context. If I say, we need to go now, bye, that probably means someone else and I need to go, and you're going to stay, so you're excluded from this we. That's an exclusive use. If I say, we need to go now, so let's go, the form let's in English tells you right away that it's inclusive. I mean you and me and maybe some other people, but certainly you and me would be included. So that's an inclusive form. But we, just the word we by itself, is quite ambiguous in English. More interesting yet, I think, are the cases where an English speaker unconsciously uses the word we in an exclusive manner that maybe neither the speaker nor the listeners may really be conscious of. Since exclusive we is invisible in English, since we is ambiguous, so we don't know when a person's being exclusive and when they're not, unless they explain, the full meaning and import of the speaker's words might slip right by us if we're not listening carefully enough to the surrounding words. Here's some examples which I've shown recently. We'll bring these up on the graphics. The first one, for 500 years, the Europeans crossed the United States, our ancestors, if you will. Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt made this comment in a radio show interview a couple of years ago. And when he said our ancestors, here he is a national official using this term our. Our is another form of we, of course. It's just when you're being possessive you say our rather than we. This our kind of implies a we. And who is this we in his statement? The we is Europeans. There are lots of Americans who are not European and whose ancestors were not European, whose ancestors never were crossing the United States in the way that he's referring to, and yet he says our, speaking in his official capacity as a United States official. I actually think this is a little inappropriate, and I'm sure he didn't mean to be excluding anyone, but you can tell from his choice of words referring to Europeans and so forth that when he says our ancestors, he means the ancestors of us European Americans, not the rest of us Americans. We're not talking about them. It's kind of an exclusive use in, I think, a slightly offensive way. Let's look at another one. This was said during an academic talk talking about Plains Indian women and their role in cultural preservation from 1800 to 1930. It was given to a mixed audience. I believe the speaker was non-Indian. It's a little difficult to tell. This is an interesting one. She said, just as in our culture today, now who's the we there? Just as in our culture today, she goes on to say something like, there was a distinction between everyday clothing and clothing for special occasions. Does she mean our Indian culture today versus the Indian culture in the 1800s? I'm not sure because I wasn't sure of her own ethnicity. Or does she mean today's majority culture versus the Plains Indian culture back then? It's hard to tell. The word our is quite ambiguous in English, and so it was sort of hard to follow at this point. A little later in the talk, she says, regarding women who made clothing for their families, she said, of course it won't be a nuclear family like we have. It's all the relatives. So who is this we that she's talking about now? Does she mean in the old days the Plains Indians dealt in the extended family more, and today Plains Indians have a nuclear family structure? Or does she mean versus today majority culture Americans have a nuclear family structure? It was a little unclear, and I'm sure because she was a native speaker of English and she knew what she meant and she wasn't conscious of this ambiguity, I'm sure it was clear to her what she had in mind, but it wasn't quite as clear as it might have been to the audience because of this ambiguity with respect to we. Who is this we we're talking about? Who does it include and who does it exclude? Now, exclusive we is used very extensively in the United States in political campaigns, very skillfully, by candidates who want to appeal to that community feeling, us, it's all of us I'm talking about, we're in this together kind of thing. But sometimes they'll use it in a way that actually excludes certain people who they are thereby implicitly labeling as not part of us. Maybe they're not real Americans. Who knows what they mean? It depends on the context and it depends on the politician. But this is what you might even call an ethnically exclusive use of we. It includes people of a certain ethnic group that we are identifying with, and it excludes others of other ethnic groups. Let's go to an example on the graphics. Here's a good one, and we hear people say this all the time. And they usually say it in defense of immigrants, ironically enough. They'll say, oh, look, we're all immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. You know, all America, as if all Americans, all of us, immigrated to this country, so we should be easy on immigrants because we're all immigrants. Well, of course, we're not all immigrants. I think that one is particularly offensive to Native Americans who may have been immigrants, but certainly not in the era that the speaker was referring to and not in the sense that they meant. So we, quotes around we Americans are not the so-called majority culture. When we say we to mean the majority culture, I think that's offensive because it leaves out all of the various subcultures. What we really are is a collection of subcultures, including the majority culture, which is, you know, to some extent kind of a mythical concoction of non-poor, non-elderly, European-American, educated, urban people. That's what people usually mean by we when they're using it in that rather exclusive way. But it means not only that majority culture subset of we, but it also includes Comanches, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, deaf Americans, all kinds of hyphenated Americans you can think of. And yet speakers, when they use the word we to talk about their fellow countrymen, very often aren't thinking about all these subgroups, and they are sort of subconsciously, I think, reinforcing a rather narrow view of what it is to be an American. Supposedly, we stick together as a nation, more or less, because we are a democracy, where the many form one union, as in e pluribus unum, out of many one, for the purpose of our common good. But are we really sticking together in our own minds if we use the word we to refer only to those in the subgroup with which we personally happen to identify most closely, while excluding the others? How much of a common vision do we really have? Let's look at a couple more quotes. Let's go to the, let's see, did we get this? Oh, okay, yes, that's on the same page. This is from Roma Downey, the actress. She was making a public service announcement on behalf of Save the Children. Now, what did she say? She said, well, you and I, our lives have been blessed, and we're watching pictures of poor, crippled, poor, starving, dirty children overseas somewhere. Our lives have been blessed, she said. Now, who is this we behind that our? She means people like me. Who is she? She's a rather wealthy, privileged, American upper middle class TV star. How many people listening to her are really like her, though? I think that struck me right away when I heard that as a rather odd use of our to refer to us versus these people you see on the screen who need your help. You know, there are lots of people nowadays, even extremely poor people, have TV or have occasion to watch something on TV. I don't think when she said that we have been blessed, I don't think she was including the rather unfortunate people who were watching her on TV who were very poor or, you know, missing limbs or dirty or starving or whatever. To me, it was, again, a rather exclusive use of the word we, which is open to such ambiguity in English. Let's look at another one. I think there's several new ones on this next group here. You see people so often when they're talking about American history talk about the old world versus the new world. Now we're getting away from the actual pronominal forms, the we here, and this is a little more subtle, but this is sort of taking for granted that there is some we. The old world is where we came from, right? Or at least our ancestors. It's kind of a historic use of we here too. We're getting into something rather interesting here. But again, it obviously is a little bit exclusive because who is the we, or who are the ancestors of us, such that you know, Europe was the old world and America was the new world? Well, obviously they were the Europeans who came and invaded or colonized or whatever word you want to use. They didn't include, for instance, Native Americans. This isn't. I mean, this is the old world to Native Americans, right? But when people use the old world in such a way that they take it for granted that their listeners have the same point of view that they do, it's sort of like that kind of exclusive we. It says, well, we know what we mean when we say this. You know, you and I understand this. People that don't, we're not talking about them. And it kind of leaves people out of the discourse. Another, and this is a kind of a, going back to our examples, kind of a subtle one, and this is a little stretch, but I do think it's related to the whole we business. When you say the Sooner State to refer to Oklahoma, that means the state where people live who are descended from the Sooners. Who are the Sooners? They're by definition people that weren't here when the Sooners got here. So it excludes all the people that were here before. So when we say the Sooner State, that says we, in a way it's sort of covertly saying we Oklahomans, this is what we identify with because this is where we come from, you know? And that's true for some of us, but not for all of us. It's kind of exclusive again. Taking a kind of majority point of view and saying, that's us. Those other people, they're not us. I ran across another interesting example the other day. I was in the new Albertsons grocery store over on 12th Avenue, and they have a section called ethnic. So this is their ethnic foods section, and I thought, what's in here? Some Mexican food, some Asian food, and so forth, and the Near Eastern things. So I guess what they're saying is ethnic is other than the norm. The norm is us, of course, and ethnic is what those other people eat. Well, there's lots of good Americans who eat ethnic food, who don't eat exactly what's considered kind of the majority white bread kind of culture. And again, I think when you use words in this way, even though we're not saying we anymore, we're kind of assuming a universe where the speaker or the writer says, okay, I'm at the center of this universe. This is who's in it. This is who we are. This is who I identify with. And so many of their word choices reflect these assumptions. Let's take another example. I think this is on the next page on the graphics. This is a woman who was describing her last year of illness just before she had a primary pulmonary hypertension disease, and she was about to get a heart-lung transplant. So in the year just preceding that, she says, I was no longer able to do the things we all take for granted. We all take for granted. Do we all take for granted going upstairs quickly, running around the block, not getting out of breath? Well, some of us do. Those of us that are lucky enough to be able-bodied and healthy do, but that's not all of us. So when the speaker used this term, this was in a radio interview, I believe, obviously she was only talking about certain ones of us, but she used the word we, which is most naturally, interpreted as meaning us, all of us that count, or something like that. But she was only talking about certain privileged people. Once you get onto this we stuff, you just never hear the word the same as you used to. Here's another example. Someone said, this was following the very serious spring floods in May of 1997. A citizen interviewed on radio or television, I think this one was radio, said, in North Dakota, we're still closer to the immigrant experience. Again, there's a lot of fine Native Americans living in North Dakota who never felt very close to the immigrant experience, but here's someone presuming to speak for North Dakotans and how they were dealing with this disaster, and we can deal with it because we're immigrant stock, is what this person was saying. But clearly, they were leaving out a lot of us, a lot of people up there who were dealing with the flood in some other way, according to some other explanation, I suppose. So it's a kind of exclusive we, but I think the speaker thought that they were being inclusive and speaking for the whole state. Here's another one. I heard this on NOVA, on OETA. They were talking about a certain area of Tibet, and the statement was made that the Tibetan plateau remains virtually unexplored. I think the hidden we kind of concept there is that none of us knew anything about it before. They had just told earlier in the program how people live there and that it had been inhabited by nomads for centuries. And obviously these nomads who lived there had explored it, and yet it was being described as virtually unexplored because, we hadn't explored it yet. I think that's the hidden comment that's being made. And again, I think once you start getting real sensitive to this we stuff, some of people's comments start sounding pretty odd, and you see how narrow their point of view really is. There's another odd thing that people do that could be called a special use of exclusive we. In this usage, I is not even a part of it. I was saying before, in English, we equals I plus someone else, at least one other person. But people use it sometimes so that it does not include the I part, and I just became aware of this rather recently. I think it's fascinating. This is where the speaker or the writer is trying to refer to their cultural or ethnic group and their identity with it, but they're talking about some earlier point in history when they obviously were not present. So here's an example. People say a European American a person of heritage that can trace back to the early colonists in the United States. And they say something like, when we rebelled against English rule. Well, who is that we? Again, we're talking about European Americans or the ancestors of. But obviously when I say we rebelled, I'm a European American, so I might make this statement talking about my people. If I say that, though, that we does not include me. I wasn't there. I didn't rebel. But I use the word we because I'm kind of making that connection with those people. I'm saying I'm descended from the people who did that. They're my people. I'm going to call us we, even though I wasn't there. It's interesting that you can do that in English. I don't know if that's ever done in Comanche or other languages. Here's Here's another example. President Clinton, in his inaugural address in 1997, was talking about the promise we sought in a new land. And he was talking again about the history of the United States. Well, who is this we who were seeking promise in a new land? Well, you know, it wasn't Native Americans, it wasn't people who got here later. It was a certain subset of ancestors of certain Americans of today, and it did not include William Clinton. He was the speaker, and he said, we sought a new land, and that's the use of we that talks about his ethnic heritage, but not about him personally. Here's another one. A Comanche student in one of my classes some years back said, we roamed all the way from Canada to Mexico. We were the lords of the plains. Now, this was a 20th century Comanche man talking about maybe 18th century Comanches. So I was not a part of it. This man who was doing the speaking was not included, and yet he used the word we to show his identification with the tribe, meaning my people. So it's interesting that you can also do that. It's a kind of ethnic we that does not include I. All right, let's sum it all up. I think one of the fun things about studying languages, other languages than the one that you grew up speaking, is that it helps you to see how your own language works and where it is ambiguous and what some of the other options are in language. In the case of we, it can open our eyes to all sorts of hidden messages that we didn't even know we were sending. They're so unconscious. This is yet another case where the language you speak is very closely tied to how you see the world and your place in it. See you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita.